All right, let's go. Chapter 10. Crim 1, Chapter 10. We're going to talk about sentencing. We are still talking about courts, so we know that sentencing is basically the punishment phase or almost the end of everything that happens in the court world. I'm going to skip that. I don't know why that picture is there. Okay, so the Eighth Amendment does protect us against cruel and unusual punishment. This has kind of been one of those issues that the Supreme Court has kicked around on many different occasions, because some people would argue, and probably fairly reasonably so, that putting someone to death might be considered cruel and unusual punishment. Our Supreme Court has found that that is not the case, but prisoners and people who have been sentenced in court do have a right to be treated reasonably well. Okay, so cruel and unusual punishments. There are certain types of punishment that is no longer allowed. Punishment cannot be inherently cruel. Okay, what does that mean? Again, good question. Certain conditions of confinement are unconstitutional. Things like not giving an inmate food, or locking them up in solitary for a considerable period of time, those things have been deemed to be cruel and unusual punishment. Oh, habeas corpus. Do I even want to go into this? Okay, really quick. Habeas corpus is a motion, a request that can be made in court when a person who is in custody wants to ask the people holding him, to show cause and proof that there's a valid reason for the person being detained. Okay, so to wrapping my brain around this one, a lot of times I think of Guantanamo Bay. 9/11 happened, obviously, and we went to war. And during that time, there were a lot of suspected terrorists that we Americans held in a place called Guantanamo Bay, which was not in the United States. So because it was not in the United States, we did not treat those inmates the same. We didn't have to have a court hearing and probable cause to keep them in custody. So ultimately what happened is some attorneys started filing habeas corpus motions in those cases, and the courts were letting these people out because you cannot just hold someone in custody because you want to. They have to be held legally. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so factors influencing someone's sentence: the severity of the offense, their prior record, any relevant statutory minimums. So there are certain crimes for which you have to serve a certain period of time, and then any sentencing guidelines. Pre-sentence investigation report. This is something that a probation officer does. They get as much information together as they can about the offender, including the circumstances of the offense, that defendant's educational history, family history, drug use, employment history, their family history, all that kind of stuff. They contact the victim, and they put basically as much information as they possibly can put together in a report for the judge. And the judge considers this report at sentencing. Okay? So basically, it's a report done by probation, and these are long, long reports that I used to do for a while, where we would write, 20-page reports and submit them to the court, and the court would use them for sentencing purposes. So these are some of the goals of sentencing. Retribution. I basically call that one an eye for an eye, or vengeance. So if you want retribution, you basically want vengeance or revenge. I'm going to skip deterrence right now. I'm going to come back to it. Incapacitation, that is the concept that someone is locked up so they physically are unable to commit a crime. Rehabilitation, we all know this. This is when you're trying to fix a problem. You're trying to make someone a positive or productive member of society again. And then we have deterrence, which is always kind of a hard one for me to describe, so I have examples of my deterrence. There's specific deterrence and general deterrence. And I'm telling a story. This is not true, but let's just imagine that I went out with my husband and I had went out to a friend's house, and in about an hour I had 8 shots of Fireball whiskey. And then I walked out to the car and I was like, oh, it's time to go home. And I grabbed the keys and I started to get in the car. And then I thought, oh man, remember that time I got a DUI? Remember how awful that was? Do you remember how much money it cost me and how embarrassing it was? And I had to go to jail and I couldn't drive, and it was awful. Remember that? Yeah, because of that memory, because of that example that I set for myself, I'm not going to do this again. So that's specific deterrence. I decided not to do it because of something I'd gone through in the past. So same scenario almost. So my husband and I go out, and I still have my 8 shots of Fireball in 1 hour. And then I go out to the car and I start to get in and I'm thinking about driving home. And then I go, oh, wow. Remember when my husband got that DUI? Remember how awful that was, that he had to go through all that stuff? Yeah, I'm not going to drive. General deterrence. I'm deterred by something that happened to someone else. Okay. Indeterminate sentencing and determinate sentencing. Indeterminate sentencing is basically, there's a range, and their release date depends on their behavior. Determinate sentencing, it's pretty much just a regular old set time, 5 years. Your maximum period of confinement is 5 years. You will not be in custody longer than 5 years. Indeterminate sentencing, you could get out in 5 years. You could get out in 7 years. You could stay in for the rest of your life. We just don't know. So we use both of these in California. For the more serious offenses, things like murder, first, second degree murder, manslaughter, rape, mayhem, things like that, you'll see a sentence of 25 to life, or 15 to life, or 10 to life. Those are indeterminate sentences because we don't know when the end is. If you get convicted of a vehicle theft, California Vehicle Code section 10851 sub A, the maximum period of confinement of that offense is 3 years. So that is determined. You know you will be out in 3 years. So that's the difference between those two. Some crimes have mandatory sentences attached to them. Okay. Mandatory minimum sentences. There were times when judges were making some interesting decisions and not locking people up for very violent, horrific crimes, for rape, things like that. So because some judges made these horrible decisions, the legislature felt that it was necessary to attach a certain period of time to each of these offenses and take discretion away from the judges. Oh, I'm going to just really quick talk about this. Think crack cocaine and think powdered cocaine. Who do you think of when you think of, what kind of user do you think of when you're thinking of crack cocaine? Now, typically, these are going to be probably your poor community, as opposed to powdered cocaine. Maybe your wealthier groups. So what was happening in the probably 80s, 90s, if you were convicted of possession for sales of crack cocaine, you would be in custody a lot longer than you would be if you had the same amount of powdered cocaine, right? Unfair. So sentences were being, anyways, they were found to be unfair, and those did ultimately change. Okay, next slide. Let's go. Okay, sentencing guidelines, blah, 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 blah. Okay, consecutive sentences. Okay, let's say, this is an actually decent example. I commit 5 different misdemeanor vandalisms, and I'm convicted of all of them. And the judge sentences me to 5 years, meaning one after the other, after the other, after the other. They're consecutive sentences. Okay? Concurrent sentence. Same set of circumstances. I have committed 5 misdemeanor vandalisms. If I'm sentenced concurrently, I'm doing 1 year. And I'm doing them all at the same time. Make sense? Yeah, I'm not going to go over that. Maybe I should go over sexually violent predators. What else do we got on here? Okay. Sexually violent predators. There are some offenders who have been deemed sexually violent predators. There is a certain court proceeding that they can go through, or that the prosecution can go through to keep these sexually violent predators in custody longer than their actual sentence. So I'm going to kind of just stop with that. Yep, there's an old person getting health care in prison. Capital punishment, that means the death penalty. Capital crime, the only offense for which you can be put to death in the United States is a murder. It has to be, someone has to have died for you to have, to be able to impose the death penalty. It's legal in some states and it's illegal in others. Right now in California, we have a moratorium on the death penalty, and that was because Governor Newsom came in and he decided he did not believe in the death penalty, did not think it was, I think the issue was he did not believe it was being fairly imposed across the board. So although our laws haven't changed, we still have the death penalty on the books in California. We do not, it is not a possible consequence as long as Governor Newsom is in office. Before this happened, it had been more than 10 years since anyone had been put to death in California anyway, but that's the way it is in California right now. There was a short period of time when the Supreme Court in the early 1970s believed that that capital punishment was cruel and unusual punishment. Get him out of here. Sorry. Sorry about that. My dogs, yet once again, were trying to get involved in my lecture here. Anyway, so there was a short period of time. So if you can think back to, what's his name? Charles Manson. Charles Manson committed some pretty horrific murders in the early 1970s. And a lot of people probably be asking themselves, like, why do I keep hearing every 2 years that Charles Manson is up for a parole hearing? So he did not get the death penalty because he committed his crimes during that short time in the early 1970s where there was a moratorium on the death penalty. But it is no longer the case, and the death penalty is legal in some states in America. Not all. We already kind of talked about this. There are two phases to a death penalty case. The first phase is the actual trial for guilt or innocence, and then the second phase is to address whether or not the person should be put to death. There were issues where the courts did believe that racial discrimination was an issue with the death penalty. And like I said before, I believe that's the concern of Governor Newsom as well, as to why we're not doing it in California right now. Some states allow for, actually all states that have the death penalty allow for lethal injection. Some of them still offer hanging, the gas chamber, or there's one more, the firing squad. This is not accurate anymore because California, well, I guess we still do technically have the death penalty, but we do have a moratorium on it. So you'll see no death penalty in all those states. California, we are one of the very few that offers the gas chamber. Crazy, huh? So lethal injection or gas chamber. In Oklahoma here, you can be electrocuted, go before the firing squad, get the gas chamber or lethal injection. I don't know where the hanging state, I feel like I don't know where it is. I can't tell which one is the darker color, but you can choose hanging in one state. We already talked about this. The Corey Muhammad case, I believe, is going to be in this stage really soon. and now I'm recording this during the coronavirus pandemic, so I'll probably show this to a class again after that, but Corey Muhammad, murder in the city of Fresno. Anyways, he's going through the second portion. Just a chart about death, sentence to death. Of course, this is the ongoing issue. Should we have the death penalty? Should we not? These are some arguments in favor. These are some arguments against it. And there's some more. Big issue, the Innocence Project. There have been people who have been executed in the United States and later found to be not guilty. Granted, this was hundreds of years ago, but it has happened. Life without parole is an alternate to the death penalty. It costs just about the same to put someone to death as it costs for them to be in custody for life without parole. And that's it. Yes, I made it. Only one interruption with the dogs.